and thank you for attending this presentation. So my name is Lingfors. I'm actually the same division as Magnus and Joachim in Uppsala. And today I will present a current project where we look at how to develop a new methodology for utility scale solar guides, quite similar to wind solar guides, which are wind guides, which are already in place in many countries in Northern Europe. So this is the agenda of the presentation. First, I will go through some background, why we started this project. And then I will go into the methodology that we have developed and show some results from a case study in a municipality in Sweden. And then in the end, I will also talk a little bit about what we are doing right now with some scenario models that we try to develop. And finally, some conclusions. So some background. Photovoltaics, or PV, mainly consists of two markets, but it's one technology, so it's very scalable. So for the Swedish case, we mostly have had distributed PV the last decade, while in many other parts of the world, there are also bigger systems, so-called PV parks, which are run by the utilities. And the difference here is that there are some different drivers of these two kinds of systems, where the distributors is often referred to owned by so-called prosumers, where self-consumption is the main driver for these systems in many countries. They are also often subsidized. There might be feed-in tariffs or capital subsidies on the investment. And they are to some extent competing on the market, on the electricity market, where you sell part of the electricity. But in contrast with the larger scale, utility scale PV parks, the main idea is to only compete on the market where you sell all the electricity. So Sweden differs quite a lot from the rest of the world when it comes to the distribution of centralized versus distributed systems. So globally, to the right here, you can see that most systems installed every year are actually centralized, so larger parks, where all the electricity is sold to the grid. While in Sweden, it has been mostly distributed system, and this is the case for many emerging markets. So what we can see in Sweden now is that we start to have a little bit more of PV parks in recent years. And you can see this on the next slide. So what actually happened is that last couple of years, we've had some megawatts parks built. And the most recent one is actually, and the biggest one now, is the one outside Linköping in Sweden, which is 12 megawatts. And I just checked a bit on the countries around the Baltic region, and I think, I mean, Denmark is a bit ahead of Sweden, and of course Germany is the big leader here. But also we see some parks coming up in the Baltic countries, like Estonia, for instance, had a 1.5 megawatt park installed just this summer. So there are some progress going on in the region. But this is sort of the trend now, that we see a tipping point in northern latitudes where parks become economically viable. So looking ahead in Sweden, we have now about 30 megawatt installed of this centralized capacity in total, but more than 60 megawatt in total is in the pipe in the coming 2 years. So we will see a lot of new parks coming up. So as I said, there already exists some sort of utility scale wind guides, and this is to plan these big parks. You would like to find the best sites. So of course, good wind resource and minimal conflicts of interest. And for the wind industry, it's been mainly different nature values like nature reserves or Natura 2000, for instance, or the proximity to the built environment. The visibility has been a big concern also, and of course also military, especially the Air Force. But to this point, there hasn't been any of this kind of guides for solar, at least in Sweden, and very few examples in the rest of the world. There are some parts that they're trying this concept also for solar. However, there are studies on what they call PV site selection, but it's more from an academic point of view. But what you can see from the literature there, just having an example from a review paper that was recently published, what these site selection methodologies look at. They are mainly looking at the solar resource as the first parameter. Secondly, the proximity to grid, then the slope of ground. This can be an important feature. And then proximity to roads and the built environment, and finally also the land use. There are of course many other parameters you can look at, but these are the most commonly used in the literature at the moment. The solar resource is a bit special. It might of course be, it is of course very important, but if you look at the local scale, it is solar guide that we try to develop is actually focusing on a fairly high resolution, municipality level. You will have more or less the same solar resource across this municipality, at least on an hourly basis. But of course, you might have some issues with shading and these limitations very locally. So there are kind of two different ways you can look at the solar resource. In the bigger scale, you might have the local climatic conditions, but also very locally you can have shading as a limitation. But what was interesting is that many studies list the proximity to grid as the second most important. And this is something we wanted to look more into detail in this project. How can we actually go a bit further and not just measure the distance to the grid, but also can we actually connect a PV park to the grid? What are the limitations there? So what we did was to combine traditional spatial analysis, looking at the best suitable land for PV parks, but also the most suitable locations in the grid. And the reason for this is that the connection cost, both for wind actually and for solar PV park, is that the connection cost is a substantial part, 10 to 15% of the project cost. So if you can find places in the grid where you have already strong connection points, you can save some money, and this can, in this sort of time where we are on a tipping point to have feasibility for PV parks, this might be crucial to find low connection costs. So just shortly how the grid is, what it looks like. So traditionally we've had large power producers and then distributing the system downstream in the grid to the consumers through different parts, like from the transmission grid to the regional grid and down to the distribution grid. But in recent years, we had both wind and solar, which we can call distributed generation, which sort of affects the grid in a way that it hasn't been built for. So there are some standards and regulation on the quality that must be maintained in the grid. So this is a representation of the three grids you saw in the three parts of the grid that you saw in the previous slide. You have the high voltage part, you have the medium voltage part, the regional grid, and you have the low voltage grid, the distribution grid. So at the customer, for instance, you should not have a difference in voltage from the nominal that is more than 10%. So what we did, and this is referred to as the hosting capacity of the grid. So we've seen in many previous studies that the voltage, the overvoltage when it comes to PV is the most crucial parameter. Then there are of course other measures such as the current, which is also quite important. For wind power, harmonics has been one issue in some cases, but for solar it's mostly the overvoltage issue that limits the PV deployment into the grid. In this project, we actually looked at PV parks connected to the medium voltage substations. So we focused on the overvoltage problem in the medium voltage side, so not looking into the low voltage. And then to have some slack to the customer side, we decided after talking to the grid operator that 3% is a conservative but good limit to give some slack to the consumer. So we looked in this case at a small municipality in Sweden, Herrljunga, with about 5,000 customers. So you have two feeding stations, one from the north and one from the south, the blue dots here. So basically we run simulations on the two grids separately, even though you can connect them. So just going back to that previous slide, yellow and green dots here are substations between the regional and the distribution grid. And the blue dots, the two blue dots are feeding stations between the higher voltage level of the regional grid and the lower level of the regional grid. So previously we've done similar studies on rooftop mounted PV, and we saw then that with these small scale PV systems, you can have quite a lot of PV in the grid, up to 30% without any grid issues. However, there are parts in the grid further out from the densely built areas, which are the yellow parts in this map, where most of the people live in this municipality, which can be more affected if you introduce PV, and especially this is where you would typically find good spots for PV parks, larger installations. So there is an interesting task of looking into where to place these solar parks. So we run similar simulations for Herrljunga, where we put out parks of some different sizes, 1, 3, and 5 megawatts. And the green dots here represent a substation where you could actually add a park. So it's quite good for adding just 1 megawatt, but when you start to think of larger systems, you start to get issues, especially in the rural areas. Still, you can put a park in the more urban areas of the municipality. So I need to also stress here that we only put out one park at a time, so we haven't put out several parks. That is something I will talk about in the end. So of course, if you put multiple parks out, you will have see more issues in the grid after a while. And we will also discuss a bit about this obligation of the grid operator that they must accept a new connection and how these maps can be used in the dialogue with the contractor. So the other part of this solar guide is to look at what areas are actually suitable and which are unsuitable. So we looked from the literature that other open land, meaning that not used for agricultural business, could be used. Of course, this is a bit, other open land can mean many things, so you have to go into detail. So one limitation is, of course, how detailed your maps are, your GIS layers. But what we also seen is that you can use pasture land. This is actually a good combination, having grass feeding animals walking around the PV modules, and keeping the land open and having no shade from the grass growing up, which might be a problem. So this is a good combination, actually. Then, of course, there's a long list of unsuitable areas. You have the built environment, you cannot build a park in the city, and you have to keep some distance. You cannot build them too close to roads and railways, even though it's good to be fairly close for the infrastructure purpose to get them deployed. You cannot be too near water bodies due to the shore protection. And you might want to be close to wind power, but there are areas that are designated for wind power, which you might not want to touch also. And then of course, you have again the military obstacle that limit the suitable areas. And cultural heritage is another one. And this list can be even longer. So this is an overview of the whole methodology. I've already explained shortly the left part here with the simulations where we put out one PV park at a time. And to the right, you see the spatial analysis where we have the suitable areas, we have the unsuitable areas like nature reserves and so on. And then around some layers, we had to put a buffer. So roads and railways 10 and 20 meters respectively, and then buildings 100 meter and water 100 meter also due to this shore protection. And then we combine these to get a new layer which we call qualified areas. So now we have qualified areas and we have qualified substations which can host PV parks. But then again, these need to be fairly close to each other also, if it should be interesting to make this installation. And so we created a new buffer where we have the distance between qualified areas and qualified substations. And then we have the final approved substation and approved area, which is a pair, you could say. So this is also another way of explaining this. So you have unsuitable areas, you have suitable areas. Sorry, there's some Swedish text still here. We go one step further where we have qualified areas, meaning that they are big enough to have a PV park on it. And we have the qualified substations. And then in the final step, we see which of these areas are close enough to a substation. And then finally, we have a pair here of approved area and approved substation, which we can build our park on. And if we look at how this developed in this case study, for instance, we have 3% of qualified area for a 1 megawatt park of the whole municipality, but only less than 1% is actually approved because there's a limited proximity to a strong grid. And in this case, we've chosen 750 meters as a threshold. This is another example showing similar how from the start we have the suitable areas, the pink areas, and then putting these layers on top, we end up with a much smaller qualified area, which is, in this, we have a threshold of 20,000 square meters, which approximately can host a 1 megawatt park. And this is also an example where we show the results from the study. So we have all the places where we can have 1 megawatt parks with a substation that could host this park next to it. And we have also a few 3 megawatt park, I think it's 8 in total, and it's 5, or for the 5 megawatt park, it's just 2 sites where you can have this size. So you limit your options quite a bit applying these different filters. But on the other hand, this is a good basis for the discussion between different stakeholders. You have the grid operator, you might have the landowner, different authorities like the municipality or the county board, and you have the contractor who builds the system. So they can look at the map and see what options there are that can be used and saving some money without installing a new substation, for instance. So in this way, we'll have a faster and more resource efficient implementation. So finally, I will just discuss a little bit of what we're doing right now. So there is an issue of how to allocate the cost for a reinforcement if this is needed. Because in some cases, you actually have to reinforce. You have a very good piece of land, the landowner is willing to sell or rent the land, and you need a reinforcement of some kind. And then the traditional way of paying for this reinforcement is the cost pauser pays, meaning that if you want to build there, you have to pay all the cost yourself. But then this might be an obstacle for new deployments. If we want to transition into more renewables, then we might need to share these costs in order for something to happen. So another way of doing this is group cost allocation. So if many contractors are willing to install some solar, they could look at the cost together and share them before the installation. And then the third version here, or alternative, is post-upgrade allocation. So the utility or the grid operator pays upfront and then get reimbursement when new installations come. But then, of course, you need to have some sort of scenario or idea of how many will actually be interested in installing. So that's why we looked at some different scenarios. And the fourth one here is quite similar to the third one, just that the difference is that the grid operator reinforce the grid and then market this available space. So trying to sell to the contractor, well, establish over here. And this is a bit of the idea with the utility scale solar guide, the map that can be used by the grid operator to, even without reinforcement, marketing good spots in the grid where contractors can develop their solar parks. So we can also look at scenarios. This is what we look at now then.
Sorry, David. You might want to wrap up because you used up.
So this is currently what we're doing. I don't go into detail, but we can look at scenarios. For instance, you want to reach a certain goal of 10% PV penetration in the municipality. You can allocate system and see what would be the cost, and then fairly distribute the cost among the contractors. So this is what we look at right now. So to conclude, we've presented or we worked on a novel approach for combining the grid and land use analysis for utility scale solar guides. We saw that 3% of the rural municipalities qualified for a 1 megawatt park, but only less than 1% is good if we also include existing grid capacity in the analysis. And this solar guide can be used as a basis in the discussion between stakeholders. So thank you for listening.